11 years ago, Iron Man was released and everything changed. The film's legacy is the centerpiece of the modern cinema-going experience and shows no signs of stopping anytime soon. Iron Man also happens to be a really good film 11 years later. There is an energy to it that has rarely been matched since its release, both within and outside of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. While the story is on a much smaller scale to where Tony Stark and the MCU as a whole ultimately goes, this film lays the foundation for what would become the franchise we know and love today.
Not bad.
Its characters, tone, story, and themes all coalesce into an almost perfect origin story for Tony Stark's avenging hero. It also serves as ground zero for a much bigger and unique movie franchise which the character of Iron Man belongs to. While some aspects of the film have aged poorly, like the by-the-numbers final boss-style finale, the heavy-handed post-9/11 terrorist threat that is, surprise, secretly controlled by a white man in a suit, and the dated, even at the time, product placement of things like sliding phones being used by a man who has fully interactive 3D holograms and gesture-controlled displays on every flat surface of his house. The film still works, exceedingly well, because at its core, it is more than just another superhero movie full of explosions and cool costumes. It is a film that focuses on the person beneath the colourful costume, and is all the better for it. So let's cast our minds back to May 2008 and dig into what makes Iron Man such a special film.
We're going to start off nice and easy. You're going to see 10% thrust capacity, chief lift. And 3, 2, 1.
The financing deal for the first batch of Marvel Studios movies was a huge gamble. The short version of the story is that to secure funding, Marvel Studios would have to release multiple successful movies over a short period of time, or risk losing the rights to most of their library of characters. Rights that they had slowly been clawing back from various film studios for several years. For their plan to work and to keep control of their property, Marvel Studios' first film had to be a success. Rather than looking at their available roster of characters and focusing on the more well-known quantity like, say, the Hulk, who audiences had seen in multiple notable adaptations over the decades to be the face of the new series of films, Marvel Studios instead picked Iron Man, a character that at the time was only known by people who were huge comic book nerds, like me, or 90s cartoon fans, also like me. A character so on the periphery of pop culture that there were concerns that audiences would be confused and think he was a robot instead of a man in a suit. But the Marvel Studios team knew that the inherent appeal of Iron Man as a character could lead them to huge success. So they pushed ahead with a multi-pronged approach to raising awareness of the character. They commissioned some animated shorts to help decrease the robot or man confusion. They also gave the comic side of things a heads up so they could place a spotlight on the character in the year or two before the film came out. Finally, they made sure that the first trailer clearly laid out who Tony Stark is and why we should care about him and his metal suit. No cryptic teasers here, just a very clear look at Tony's journey from bad guy to hero. The other big risk was picking who would play Tony Stark. In a move that many questioned at the time, Robert Downey Jr. was their choice to lead the film. His rocky personal life and brushes with the law were well known, but director Jon Favreau saw the potential in Downey playing the part, and fought hard for him to be hired, while Robert Downey Jr. himself saw the role as a character he was destined to play.
Robert really wanted to play Tony Stark, and I really wanted him to play Tony Stark. It wasn't the most obvious choice from a studio's point of view. Unfortunately, Marvel is a new studio with a lot of freedom. We weren't dealing with the classic studio system where they have their lists that they generate. There was a lot of freedom to cast the best person for the role, because fortunately with Marvel movies, the image of the superhero is in fact the big draw, the big star. And they've learned that they've had a lot of success in the past when they've hired people who are good, interesting actors and relied upon the name of the brand itself to sort of be the thing that becomes the rallying cry from a commercial standpoint.
So Marvel Studios took a gamble on top of a gamble, and Robert Downey Jr. was cast as Iron Man, albeit one surrounded by familiar and equally respected actors, to the extent that, reportedly, Terrence Howard was paid more than Downey Jr. for the film because he was a more bankable name at the time. Then you have the Hollywood mainstays like Jeff Bridges and critical darlings like Gwyneth Paltrow rounding out the rest of the cast. All familiar faces, but not ones known for superhero movies. The third big risk Marvel took with Iron Man was its more organic approach to script and story development. While the increasingly mythic story of the film's production says most of Iron Man was improvised, made up on the fly to great effect, the reality of the situation is that the core story and Tony's journey were there from the beginning, with the VFX-heavy sequences that the film hangs on being locked in early because that stuff takes a long time to make. What was workshopped and changed during production was how Tony gets to those set pieces. This workshopping approach actually allowed the film's creative team to refine the story they were telling during production, making it tighter and less bloated with direct comic book references and setups. You can see this in the behind-the-scenes footage for the film, where early in production, Obadiah was set up to be the villain in the sequel, and the Mandarin was the intended big bad, working from the shadows, using classic Iron Man enemies like the Red Dynamo to attack Tony and what he represents.
When I met with John the first time, he said, "Oh no, you don't get to wear a suit." And I kind of went, "Oh." And because it was the Mandarin was originally then there was going to be like two different bad guys, and I said, "Oh, yeah. Okay, well, let's see, how it works out." And then the scripts were being worked on, and it came back. He says, "No, it looks like you wanted to wear a suit. Now you've got your suit." I said, "Oh, great."
The remnants of this plot can be seen in what became the many Easter eggs that pepper the film, most notably in the terrace being called the Ten Rings and key characters wearing gaudy rings on odd fingers, all showing links to the bigger threat of the Mandarin. It is a hectic way to make a movie, but one that Iron Man needed so it could succeed. There is a sense that Marvel Studios found their cinematic universe in this film because some level of experimentation was allowed. Iron Man manages to do the traditional superhero film adaptation while also adding in something very new for the time, the concept of a wider universe.
I am Iron Man. You think you're the only superhero in the world? Mr. Stark, you've become part of a bigger universe. You just don't know it yet.
Iron Man provides the template for slow and steady universe building Marvel Studios have used to great effect for the past 11 years. Iron Man, and by extension the MCU, work so well because they do not throw new concepts from the comics at the audience every 15 minutes. It is more measured and teased out over time. The MCU works and continues to work because the wider world building was done in small steps until it reached the point where it could naturally take big leaps. You don't go from Iron Man straight to Captain America Civil War. You build up to it until your characters have legitimate reason to punch each other in the face over their ideological differences. You don't introduce your universe-shaking MacGuffins and big bads until people are connected to your main characters and know what is personally at stake for them in the battle to end all battles. Iron Man shows the benefits of building a cinematic universe around the people who inhabit it, rather than the other way around. The universe building in Iron Man is so finite that it fits into 3 easily digestible categories. Category 1. Iron Man stuff. This gets the most focus in the film because it is the usual movie franchise building stuff. Hints at possible future villains and directions the protagonist's journey could go in. Iron Man has the added benefit of most of this being hidden in plain sight, thanks to the de-scoping of the story during production. Concepts like the Ten Rings and the Mandarin become background details and little teasers of what could happen down the line, with further hints towards Tony's destructive personality and drinking being seeded throughout the film in scenes they could naturally fit in. The most obvious future nod is that Rhodey will eventually become War Machine thanks to his involvement in the main story and that very telling next time moment. That's all of it. No setups for grand overarching narratives here, just teasers of possible futures contained within the beats of the film's core story. Category 2. S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff. Included in the film to start giving the audience a sense that there is a bigger world coming into shape. Originally planned as just the post-escape meeting and a couple of smaller beats, ending with the full S.H.I.E.L.D. name drop before the credits. Once again, the organic approach to making the film meant they could expand Phil Coulson's role once they realised Clark Gregg had a really good chemistry with the rest of the cast. It works well for the fledgling universe because it gives S.H.I.E.L.D. a presence over the whole film. Coulson pops up semi-regularly to remind you there are people outside of Tony's sphere of influence keeping an eye on him, culminating in Coulson taking an active role in bringing down Obadiah and saving the day with Pepper and Tony. The S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff also works on multiple levels. The surface layers for people coming to Iron Man without knowing what S.H.I.E.L.D. and the wider Marvel Universe are. To them, Phil Coulson is just an agent from a special task force, a bit like the CIA or FBI, there to show Tony's actions having a big impact outside his bubble within Stark Industries. The next layer is a bit deeper, and is for people who grin knowingly to themselves as soon as Coulson says,
"I'm Agent Phil Coulson with the Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement and Logistics Division."
That's quite a mouthful.
It's a nice recurring gag that gives hints at S.H.I.E.L.D. being a big player in the future Iron Man films, and maybe some of the other films Marvel Studios had in the pipeline at the time. It is purposefully downplayed so that the next category lands with maximum impact. Category 3. Avengers stuff. Contained to a shot of a prototype Captain America S.H.I.E.L.D. and the post-credits scene. Also the knowledge that maybe 15% of the audience had at the time that the Hulk movie due out after Iron Man is going to be linked to it in some way. The Avengers stuff, in particular the post-credits scene, builds on the S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff in such an elegant way. Not just as a reward for fans staying to the end of the credits, but as a promise that Marvel Studios were going to attempt the impossible. Looking back on it now, and to be a little bit hyperbolic, it may be one of the most significant moments in modern cinema history. The reveal of Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury, telling Tony he is part of something bigger and that he is there to talk to him about the Avenger Initiative, is a small scene with huge implications. It is a call to action for the rest of the movies Marvel Studios were going to make. Everything now had to build up to the Avengers. It adds a nice wrinkle to the whole film, making it the starting point for a much bigger story without changing the overall focus of the film itself. While there is a common misconception thrown at Marvel movies that they are just teasers for the next film, Iron Man is very restrained. All of its setups for future installments are short, sweet, and do not interfere with the main story of the film.
That's what we do. You'll be hearing from us.
From the Strategic Homeland and
Just call us S.H.I.E.L.D.
right.
They're aimed at people like me, the sort of person who will smile and nod at them in the cinema. The person who will then tell all their friends about what they could mean and where the story could go because of them. Marvel Studios know that the central character and their story is always more important than seeding a sequel, a rule they have stuck to with every subsequent film they have made.
What's the world coming to when a guy's got to crash his own party?
Look at you.
But who is Tony Stark?
I am Iron Man.
Okay, fine, but why do we care about him? Tony Stark is a very familiar character that treads across a few key archetypes. He is the eccentric genius, one part Sherlock Holmes with his high-functioning intelligence that lets the audience enjoy seeing him solve things outside of their understanding. One part Batman, the super-rich guy with a AI personal assistant, and a company with his name on it taking matters into his own hands, bringing justice to an unjust world. He's also part Howard Hughes, a key inspiration for the character in the comics. A man with limitless ambition that forced him to keep pursuing his ideas to the detriment of his personal life. Tony Stark has all the trappings of genius that skirts into madness, intelligence and charm backed up by a host of personal issues. This helps to give the audience a well-defined and nuanced hero to latch onto. However, the thing that keeps the audience invested in Tony Stark, and by extension the MCU as a franchise, is Tony Stark's personal journey.
I had my eyes open. I came to realize that I have more to offer this world than just making things that blow up. And that is why, effective immediately, I am shutting down the weapons manufacturer division of Stark International.
Iron Man's plot is built around three big action-heavy sequences. These events have to happen because the audience expects them to. It is a superhero movie after all. What causes these sequences to happen, though, are the choices Tony Stark makes, and how the consequences of those decisions grow, change, and combine to create new challenges for him to overcome. The first is when Tony escapes from the Ten Rings, which happens because of the film's inciting incident. Tony seeing his name printed on the side of the missile that almost kills him. Something that happens because of the decisions Tony has made throughout his adult life before the film begins, and in much of the first act. The thing that truly moves Tony's character onto the path to herodom are the lessons Yinsen imparts to Tony while they are being held by the Ten Rings. Yinsen reveals Tony's true legacy to him as a man responsible for uncountable death and destruction. The combination of Yinsen and the situation Tony finds himself in cause him to have a fundamental change of heart, which is sealed in place with Yinsen's dying wish.
Don't waste it. Don't waste your life.
And from that point on, Tony doesn't. Through Yinsen, Tony decides to survive his current situation and put right his mistakes. He may slip up from time to time, but in this moment he goes from passive player in the world to active protector. Without Yinsen, the story of the film doesn't happen. Without Yinsen, the story of the MCU doesn't happen. Because without Yinsen, Tony Stark doesn't become someone willing to sacrifice himself to save others, to become
The guy to make the sacrifice play? To lay down on a wire and let the other guy crawl over you?
From the moment Yinsen dies, Tony keeps making decisions that affect the course of his life and by extension the film. He begins his journey of redemption from villain to hero. The second big set piece is the liberation of Gulmira, which happens as a direct result of Tony's decision to stop Stark Industries making weapons. A decision that gives Obadiah his opportunity to push Tony out of the company while he is busy refining the Iron Man suit. In the build-up to Tony flying off, we see a quietly building rage that comes from the wider world second-guessing his actions and thinking he has lost it, which the film goes to great lengths to hammer home.
Stark Industries. I've got one recommendation. Ready? Ready? Ha-ha! Sell. Abandoned ship! Does the Hindenburg ring any bells?
So when Tony learns that he's being pushed out of his company by one of his closest allies, and that the weapons he designed are being openly sold to terrorists, the very ones he escaped from and who are holding the village his mentor came from hostage, Tony is forced to take matters into his own hands. We see Tony make the choice to go on the offensive. He He makes some final adjustments to the suit and is off to deliver a good old-fashioned beatdown, with the liberation of Gulmira and the troubled trip home becoming the moment that changes everything. We see Tony avenging Jensen's death and starting to do something about the damage he has personally caused, with swift, destructive force. A display of power that does three things. 1. It makes Iron Man look like a true badass. He walks away from explosions and everything. 2. Shows that the weapons of old are useless against Iron Man. Guns are humanity's go-to weapon in the modern age. Tony Stark has clearly surpassed them. 3. Which in turn shows Obadiah that Tony won't go down without a fight, and that he will need to take everything from him by force. All of which leads us to the story's inevitable conclusion, stopping Obadiah, which is the culmination of all of Tony's character growth. It is what Tony's journey is all about, going from a carefree life of zero consequences to needing to accept responsibility for his actions. So, as Tony crawls through the literal ruins of his life because of his failure to look past himself, he is once again forced to make a choice, one that takes him back to what happened in the cave. Give up and die, or survive and correct your mistakes. Except this time, Tony isn't saving himself. This time he is saving Pepper, and by extension the rest of the world from Obadiah, proving that he has learned the lesson he needed to learn, that a true hero puts others before himself, and that yes, Tony Stark does indeed have a heart. His choices before the film starts and in its opening cause the events of the story to happen. He creates his own enemies by making weapons and letting people like Obadiah run the business while he lives a guilt-free life, not thinking about whose hands they end up in. Iron Man is a film about coming to terms with your past mistakes, learning from them and trying to do the right thing going forward. Tony's story has a message to it, the same universal message many Marvel stories, in particular origin stories, have.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Finally, the moment that brings it all together and cements Tony Stark's character for the next decade is the closing scene of the film, where it uses the trappings of the early Iron Man comic books to set up something new. We get a nice nod to the Bodyguard cover idea before it is subverted, with Tony's declaration that he is Iron Man. It works so well because the expectation is that Tony will follow in the footsteps of other well-known movie superheroes and keep his identity secret. While the status of Iron Man's true identity being known has fluctuated within the comics over the years, to wider audiences up to this point, superheroes always lived double lives because it was the done thing. Here we get a new twist on the idea, one completely driven by the character of Tony Stark that has developed over the course of the film. He is a hero, the climax of the film shows that, but he is still Tony Stark. So of course he wants the world to know it is him in the fancy suit, to know that he is no longer the seedy businessman with slicked back hair, but instead this new hero that has changed the world. He wants everyone to know somewhat selfishly that he is actually a good guy now. For me, it is a perfect moment because you can see the wheels turning in Tony's head as he starts speaking. He knows the cover story is weak, so once again he makes a decision that changes the direction of his story. A choice that shows how far he has come, but more importantly, how far he has yet to go. I Am Iron Man shows he is redeemed for his past actions, but is still the same character who drew you into the film. Tony Stark is a flawed character, and the film does away with tradition to stay true to that. This is also an important moment for Marvel Studios because it showed them what they can change from the comics. As Kevin Feige explains in an interview with Deadline about the history of the MCU. It's a fine line. If you're changing something for no reason, that's one thing, but if you're changing something because you want to double down on the spirit of who the character is, that's a change we'll make. I think it did inspire us in all the movies. What I love now, 20 movies in, is how fans expect the MCU to change and adapt. They expect us to be inspired by the comics as opposed to being slavishly devoted to them. It shows Marvel Studios have a level of understanding of the source material they use that few other studios do. They understand that you can never do a one-to-one adaptation, but know that any changes must be done with the character's core personality and appeal at their heart. An understanding that makes Iron Man such an enjoyable film, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe such a compelling franchise. The success of Iron Man made Tony Stark the main character of the MCU, turning him into a household name in the process. Right up to the conclusion of Avengers Endgame, whenever Tony Stark is on screen, you stop and take notice, because of the groundwork laid out in his first adventure. For over 11 years of storytelling, we've seen Tony Stark and Iron Man grow and change, always learning, always adapting to the ever-growing threat, always being the smartest person in the room, all while remaining true to the core character that is defined in Iron Man. Always going back to the lesson he can never forget that gave him the push to become the flawed hero the world needs. Iron Man is about much more than a fancy suit. It is a film about realizing you have been part of the problem, and that only drastic, irreversible change can fix it. It is a very human and recognizable story told on the superheroic scale in a way that only the Marvel Cinematic Universe can provide. It is why when Tony says, "I am Iron Man," you agree completely with his statement. He is a hero, warts and all.